If you have watched any of my videos, then you would know that I'm all about temperature control. It is one of the most important parts of the bread making process, and I have already published several videos about temperature control and about the effect temperature has on fermentation. But all of those previous videos have been about room temperature fermentation. What about cold fermentation? Does final dough temperature actually matter if the dough is going to be cold anyway? Quite a few people have asked me about this already, so it's time to do some experiments. Usually I stick to around 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit. I have never actually tried to deliberately make my dough too warm or too cold and then try to cold ferment it. But that is exactly what we are going to do today. We will make 3 breads, all containing exactly the same ingredients: white bread flour, whole wheat bread flour, yeast, salt, olive oil and water. The only difference will be temperature, and the way we control it is by adjusting the temperature of the water. One dough will be too cold, another one will be just right, and the final one will be too warm. Just for reference, my kitchen is around 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit right now. All 3 doughs will be made exactly the same way. We'll mix the dough, we'll place it in the fridge to cool down for 30 minutes, we'll remove it from the fridge to give it a fold, and then place it back into the fridge for the long cold fermentation. This is not a recipe video, so I'm not going to talk you through the bread making steps here. Instead, I'll just talk about temperature control and why it's important, during which you can watch me make 3 breads in the background. The ideal final dough temperature for your cold fermented dough will depend on the temperature of your fridge, the composition of the dough, and even the mass of the dough. If your fridge is very cold, then your dough should be warmer, and vice versa. If your dough contains ingredients that may speed up fermentation, then you can make it a little bit cooler to not over ferment it. The larger the dough, the more actively it will ferment. So if you are making a large batch, make it slightly cooler. Of course, all of the above can also be solved by adjusting the amount of yeast. I personally prefer keeping the recipe formulas consistent. That is why I choose temperature control as the variable. My fridge usually hovers around 5 degrees Celsius or 41 degrees Fahrenheit. I usually aim for a final dough temperature of between 23 degrees Celsius to 25 degrees Celsius, which is 73 degrees Fahrenheit to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. It is the same temperature range that I use for cold fermentation as well as room temperature fermentation. At this temperature range, the doughs that I usually make will cold ferment sufficiently in 12 to 24 hours. So let's see what temperatures we got here. From left to right, we have the dough that is too cold, then the one that is just right, and finally the one that's too warm. The first one is only 18.5 degrees Celsius. It's pretty cool. The second dough ended up being around 25 degrees Celsius, which is just about right. And the one that's too warm ended up being 27.5 degrees Celsius. I'll pop them all in the fridge for 30 minutes, then give them a fold and leave them to cold ferment. Folding the dough ensures that it cools down evenly, and it will make it cool down more quickly. As the dough sits in the fridge, the outside of it will naturally cool down sooner. Folding the dough will mix the cooler outer part with the warm inside, which will distribute the temperature more evenly throughout it, which as a result will also make it ferment more evenly. But why would we make a warm dough and then actively try to cool it down quickly once it's been placed in the fridge, I hear you ask. Yeast will not be very active below 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So if the dough is at that temperature or even lower, it may take a lot longer to start fermenting. And then when it cools down even more, it may not ferment at all. But if the temperature is too high, on the other hand, fermentation may get out of control. The temperature must be within the correct range for the fermentation to be predictable. We fold our dough and try to cool it down slightly to ensure that it ferments evenly, but having the correct temperature at the beginning will ensure that it starts fermenting at all. As we can see, after giving all the doughs a fold, they have dropped down by a few degrees. The middle dough, which was at the correct temperature, is now only 20 degrees Celsius, which would have been too low if it had started off at that temperature. But because fermentation had begun, there was no stopping it, even after the temperature dropped. Okay, it's been around 24 hours, let's check in on our dough balls. And straight away we can see some clear differences. The dough which was too cold to begin with has not risen at all. The one that was at the right temperature had come up to the lid, which is perfect, it had doubled in size during bulk fermentation. And the dough that was slightly too warm had lifted up the lid, and if I had left it in the fridge for a bit longer, it would have started climbing out of the bowl. Of course that wouldn't be the end of the world. If it had been slightly warmer, it may already have climbed out, but obviously a couple of degrees didn't make much of a difference. Better be too warm than too cold, that's for sure. Yeast is most active between 27 degrees Celsius to 37 degrees Celsius, which is 80 degrees Fahrenheit to 98 degrees Fahrenheit. At these high temperatures, it'll produce a lot of carbon dioxide very quickly, which would make the dough puff up and rise as much as the gluten structure would allow it to. But there is a downside to quick fermentation, which is a lack of flavor development. That is why we usually go for a lower temperature to get a good balance between the rise and flavor. Everything happens more slowly during cold fermentation. It produces superior flavor over many hours. Letting the dough sit for so long also allows the flour to absorb all the water, which makes the dough easier to handle, which can allow us to increase the hydration, which can result in a more open crumb and a crispier crust. This is why I love cold fermentation, and I believe it is the superior bread making method. Okay, let's see what it takes to get the cold dough to rise. It's been another 24 hours, so let's check on our dough balls. The dough that was too warm to begin with has started climbing out of the bowl and becoming dry around the edge, which again is not the end of the world. But the dough that was too cool has not moved at all, even 48 hours later. So we're going to go for some drastic measures. I'm going to place the doughs back into the fridge, leave them to ferment for 1 week. Okay, 1 week later, the dough that was too cold has risen slightly. So if you're going to get your temperature wrong, it better be too warm. Because if it's too cold and you don't do anything about it, your dough will not ferment. Getting it just right will obviously always produce the best result. But what if your dough actually turns out too cool or too warm? Is there anything you can do about it? And I'm happy to let you know that there is something you can do about it. While if you were fermenting your dough at room temperature, having it too cool or too warm could affect the fermentation time quite a lot. Luckily, when cold fermenting, time is on our side. If your dough turns out too cool, do not refrigerate it right after mixing. Instead, let it sit at room temperature for 30 to 60 minutes before giving it a fold and then refrigerating it. While the dough sits in a warm room, it will start fermenting, and by the time you place it in the fridge, the process will be in a good motion to continue. But if your dough has turned out too warm, place it in the fridge right away. But do not wait for 60 or even 30 minutes before you give it a fold. Put it in the coolest corner of your fridge and start folding it after just 10 to 15 minutes. And instead of just folding it once, repeat the step 2 or even 3 times at the same interval. This should cool it down relatively quickly and prevent it from over fermenting. If it's really warm, you can even utilize your freezer in the same way. And once the dough has cooled down sufficiently, transfer it to the fridge. Temperature control is nothing to get stressed about. Once you get used to it, you won't even think about it that much. I know that during spring, summer, and even autumn, I can use water that's been left out of room temperature, and my dough will pretty much always end up in the right temperature range. No calculations required. And even if it turns out too cool or too warm, I use the techniques I just described to you to fix it. Staying consistent with all parts of the bread making process will allow you to get predictable results every time. But that's about it when it comes to the importance of temperature control when cold fermenting. As for the finished bakes on the table here, the dough that was too cold didn't produce a very tasty bread, but the other two were pretty good. I'm not suggesting that you should ferment your dough in the fridge for 9 days, but you can if you want to. You can find a whole video about long cold fermentation in the Principles of Baking playlist, along with many more videos which you may find interesting. But that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.